The young warrior's name was xochiyaoyotl. His face was painted with ochre and black, the colors of the eagle, but the weapon in his hand was not designed for the kill. It was a xochiyaoyotl, a wooden club edged with razor shards of obsidian. At dawn on this dusty plain, his goal was not to slash throats. It was to bruise, to daze, to disarm. He scanned the opposing line not for weakness, but for strength. He needed a captive whole and healthy. This was xochiyaoyotl, the flower war. Think of it as the most high-stakes sport imaginable. The feeling of playing a game where the goal isn't to win, but to capture a specific player, except the stakes are life, death, and the favor of the gods themselves. The Aztecs and their rival city-states like Tlaxcala would arrange these battles by mutual agreement. A sacred harvest. The field was the crop, and the crop was human. The signal came, a blast from a conch shell. The lines collided, but the din was different. You heard the thud of wood on shield, the grunt of effort, the shout of xochiyaoyotl, take him, not the wet tear of fatal blows. Xochiyaoyotl side-dessed a thrust, using his club's flat side to batter an opponent's weapon arm. His eyes locked onto a Tlaxcalan warrior with the broad shoulders of a seasoned fighter. Perfect. The gods desired vigorous offerings. A weak captive was an insult. He fought not to destroy, but to isolate. He worked with his comrades, herding the target like a hunter corralling a prized stag. The objective was a clean capture, a grapple, a binding of the wrists with stout cord. A captured warrior was not a prisoner of war in our sense. He was a consecrated vessel walking willingly to his divine destiny. To be chosen was an honor, to refuse was unthinkable. For centuries, this was the rhythm of the Valley of Mexico, wars to feed the sun god Huitzilopochtli, lest he falter and the world end. The Aztec Empire, the Triple Alliance, grew fat on this sacred economy. Tlaxcala, encircled and never conquered, played its part in the grim liturgy season after season, generation after generation. Their young men marched out to the arranged fields, and too often did not march back, instead ascending the steps of the great temple in Tenochtitlan. The system was perfect, logical and sustainable. It kept the gods alive and the empire's rivals in a state of ritualized, controlled conflict. But here is the fatal flaw no priest could foresee. You cannot ritualize hatred. You can only bank it. Every cord that bound a Tlaxcalan warrior's wrists was another knot of resentment. Every heart offered to the sun was a seed of vengeance planted deep in the soil of Tlaxcala. The flower wars cultivated more than just sacrificial victims. They cultivated a bitter, patient, and utterly specific enemy. This sacred system, designed to feed the gods and preserve order, was slowly kindling a hatred that would consume the empire itself. The hatred was already a living thing, coiled in the hearts of every Tlaxcalan elder who had watched their sons taken. It only needed a spark. That spark would come from across the sea. But first, you must understand the altar for which this harvest was reaped. High atop the Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan, under a sun so sharp it turned the white stucco to glare, a priest named Citlali tested an edge. His instrument was not metal, but tekpatel, a blade of sacrificial flint, its obsidian core napped to a razor's gleam below him. The sacred plaza lay empty and waiting. This silence was part of the ritual. Soon it would be filled with the roar of a crowd and the scent of copal incense, watching the fruits of the flower war ascend. The system was called xochiyaoyotl for a reason. Flower war was not a metaphor, it was a literal agricultural process. Armies from Tenochtitlan and most often Tlaxcala would meet on pre-arranged sanctified fields, atlantes marked with stone boundaries. The objective was singular: capture, not kill. Conquering territory was irrelevant. This was a harvest of human beings, a cropping of the most precious resource, living tribute for the gods. Imagine a rivalry where every game is fixed, not to determine a champion, but to supply one side with prisoners for execution. The captured warrior, like the one Xochiyaoyotl sought, was treated with ceremonial reverence. He was cleansed, fed, and called xochiyaoyotl, the god's impersonator. For months, he might live in luxury, embodying the deity he was meant to join. This was the core of the logic. He was not murdered. He was released. His heart, the precious xochiyaoyotl, was the precious cactus fruit offered to sustain the sun on its daily battle through the underworld. His blood was the sacred water that nourished the earth. For the Aztec priesthood, it was a perfect, closed circuit of divine energy. The sun was fed, the rains came, the empire prospered, the war provided the fuel, the ritual converted it. But stand in the plaza of Tlaxcala after a harvest. Watch the empty spaces where young men should be. The theology meant nothing there, only the arithmetic of loss. Every season of flowers was another season of grief. The priest Xochiyaoyotl looked at his flawless blade. He saw a divine tool. A Tlaxcalan father, looking at the same distant pyramid, saw only a thief in the sky, stealing his children under a holy pretext. The system could calculate the precise number of hearts needed to stave off cosmic collapse. It could not calculate the cost in fury. That bill was about to come due, delivered by men in iron who did not fight by sacred rules. The captive's name was xochiyaoyotl. His arms were bound behind him with magui fiber ropes, coarse and tight, but his back was straight. He was marched up the 114 steps of the Great Pyramid at sunset, each tread worn smooth by countless feet before his. The air was thick with the cloying sweetness of burning copal, a sacred smoke meant to carry his spirit skyward. Below the vast plaza of Tenochtitlan was a sea of upturned faces, silent but for the deep, resonant throb of the xochiyaoyotl drum, a heartbeat counting down the last moments of his life. This was the culmination of the capture protocol. On the battlefield, the goal had been to disable, not slay. A warrior would be surrounded, his legs swept from under him with a cord, pinned and bound. The ideal captive was unharmed, valiant and strong. A worthy offering. To kill him in combat was to waste the harvest. xochiyaoyotl had fought well. That was why he was here. As he neared the summit, the world narrowed to the stone before him. The tech cattle, the sacrificial slab, stained a deep, permanent black. 4 priests in black cloaks, their hair matted with blood from previous rites, stood waiting. Their hands were not cruel, but methodical. This was a transaction. He was laid back upon the stone, his chest arched toward the dying sun. The drumming stopped. For the crowd, this was sacred theater. For xochiyawtl's family in the hills of Tlaxcala, it was the dread of a recurring nightmare you can't escape, where the outcome is always the same and everyone knows it's coming. Year after year, generation after generation, the people of Tlaxcala watched their best and bravest taken up those steps, never to return. They buried empty shrouds, they sang songs of absence. The pyramid was not a temple to them, but a hungry mouth in the sky, consuming their future one young man at a time. The priest's flint blade descended. The ritual was efficient. The heart, the xochiyaoyotl, was raised steaming toward the sun. The body was sent tumbling down the pyramid's steep side, a final brutal release. In Tenochtitlan, the sun had been fed. In Tlaxcala, another family's world went dark. This arithmetic of sacred loss was a debt, meticulously recorded in memory, not in tribute ledgers, and a debt that large can only be settled in blood. In a Tlaxcalan council chamber, smoke from a pine knot fire coiled toward the thatched roof. An elder, his face a map of deep lines, knelt and traced shapes in the packed earth floor with a calloused finger. He drew a circle for the Valley of Mexico. Then, with a slower, heavier hand, he drew a smaller circle around their own lands. No roads connected them, only arrows pointing inward. For 80 years, the flower wars had bled them, not of territory. The borders never shifted, but of their sons. The arithmetic was relentless. A good harvest year meant more strong young men. A strong young man meant a prime candidate for the obsidian blade. Their greatest strength was their own curse. Think of being stuck in a toxic, one-sided relationship you can't leave, where every interaction costs you something precious. That was Tlaxcala's existence. A ritual partner bound by sacred custom, feeding their best to a god who only promised more hunger. The resentment in that room was not hot anger. It was a cold, hard stone in every stomach. They discussed tribute, alliances, crop yields, but every decision circled back to the same silent calculation. How many would we lose this season? The Aztecs called it xochiyaoyotl, the flowery war. In Tlaxcala, they had another word for it, the endless draft. Their cities were not fortified against invasion, but against despair. They were trapped in a ritual they could not win, supplying their own executioners with victims. And then the rumors began, not of more warriors from Tenochtitlan, but of pale men with thundersticks and beasts like giant deer arriving on the eastern coast. The elder's finger hovered over his dirt map, then tapped a spot far from the Valley of Mexico, a place called the Gulf. A new arrow was about to be drawn. The scout's name was xochiyaoyotl. He lay motionless in the reeds where the lake's edge met the causeway, his body coated in gray mud to break his silhouette. For 3 days he had watched the strangers. He had seen the thundersticks speak, spitting smoke and a sound that cracked the sky, felling a pine tree in a single breath. He had seen the beasts, not deer, but something larger, with skin like stone and feet that rang on the rock, carry men in metal shells. But this was different. This was the moment. A Spanish caravel, its single square sail taut with the morning wind, glided across the still waters of Lake Texcoco. It moved toward the gleaming white city of Tenochtitlan, a floating mountain of wood and cloth that should not float. On its deck, sunlight flashed on steel breastplates and the iron barrels of arquebuses. To xochiyaoyotl, they looked like men forged entirely from metal, their faces pale and furred, their movements stiff and alien. They were not scanning the shoreline for captives. They were pointing at the temples, at the grand causeways, their gestures sharp with assessment, not ritual. Here was the dangerous outsider, and they were sailing directly toward the heart of his people's bitter enemy. The calculus that had governed Tlaxcala for generations, the grim arithmetic of how many sons to lose to the stone, flickered in his mind, then fractured. What if the arrow did not have to point inward? What if it could be turned? He remembered the elder's finger tapping the dirt map. A new arrow. These metal men had fought their way inland from the coast, crushing any who opposed them. They did not take captives for sacrifice. They killed to conquer. They did not seek strong arms for Huitzilopochtli. They sought gold, submission, land. Their very existence was a blasphemy against the Flower War, a rejection of its sacred, suffocating logic. To the Aztecs, they would be an incomprehensible threat. To Tlaxcala, they were a possible key. Xochiyaoyotl watched as the caravel passed, close enough for him to hear the strange, guttural speech of the men aboard. One of them, a figure with a beard like burnt copper and a polished steel breastplate, stood at the prow, hand on the hilt of a long, straight sword. He was not looking at the reeds. His gaze was fixed on the twin pyramids of the Templo Mayor rising in the distance. He was measuring it, not as a holy site, but as a fortress to be taken. The scout slipped back into the water, silent as a water strider. He had to get back. The report was no longer just about strange weapons and animals. It was about a single staggering possibility, an end to the draft. The gods of sun and war, who had demanded an endless harvest of blood from Tlaxcala, were about to meet a new god, one of steel shot and a hunger that had nothing to do with the heavens. The calculus of hatred was about to change forever. Xochiotl's report reached the Tlaxcalan War Council at dusk. The elders listened in a silence so profound it seemed to swallow the crackle of the fire. They did not cheer, they did not debate. They looked at one another, and in each pair of eyes was the same cold, glittering recognition. The new arrow had arrived. The question was how to knock it. Days later, in a camp on the arid plains between the mountains and the lake, the alliance was made. It was not a feast. There was no exchange of gifts. A Spanish conquistador named Alvaro sat apart, methodically polishing the barrel of his arquebus with an oiled rag. The starlight above was wrong. The constellations were strangers, tilted on their axis. Around him, Tlaxcalan warriors sharpened obsidian blades, their eyes flicking toward the metal men with a blend of awe and deep-seated suspicion. The air was not filled with camaraderie, but with a thick, watchful quiet. Two worlds, alien to each other, held together by a single focused hatred for Tenochtitlan. It was the tense, pragmatic alliance of two parties who despise each other, but who both want the same third party to lose. Their goal was not friendship, it was demolition. They were united to break the machine that had consumed Tlaxcalan's sons for a century, to shatter the altar stone itself, and they would use these strange, blasphemous men of steel to do it. The alliance was a blade forged from two different kinds of steel. It would cut, but no one knew if it would hold. The first test came not at the gates of Tenochtitlan, but on the open plain of Otumba in the summer of 1520. The Spanish were reeling, fleeing the city after the Noche Triste, their ranks halved, their armor dented, their gunpowder wet. The Aztec army that cornered them there saw not invincible gods, but wounded animals. And for the first time in living memory, an Aztec commander gave an order that broke the sacred rhythm of centuries. He did not tell his warriors to capture the strong for the altar. He told them to kill every last one. The shock was not in the order, but in its execution. On that dusty plain, the ritual shattered. A seasoned Aztec warrior, his mind trained from youth to seek a binding grip, found himself facing a Spanish pike. The instinct was to disarm, to subdue, but the pike did not withdraw for a feint. It drove forward with a singular, murderous intent, punching through cotton armor into the gut. The warrior fell, not destined for the glory of the stone, but for the anonymity of the dirt. All around him, the flower war became a harvest of corpses. The Spanish fought with a terrifying secular purpose. Extermination to survive, the Aztecs were forced to mirror it. Think about that for a second. When someone changes the fundamental rules of a game you've mastered, and suddenly all your strategies are useless. The Aztec military machine, a masterpiece of ritualized capture, was engineered for a specific kind of victory. It had no doctrine for this. Their formations, designed to encircle and isolate individuals, now pressed against a bristling square of steel and desperation. The sacred harvest had become a profane slaughter. The Spanish, for their part, fought with the chilling efficiency of men who believed in only one God, and saw no divinity in their opponents, only obstacles to be removed. The Battle of Otumba did not end with a tally of captives for the priests. It ended with a field of the dead from both sides, and a desperate Spanish cavalry charge that cut through the Aztec command, toppling a standard-bearer and sending the army into disarray. The Spanish broke through and survived, but the greater victory was invisible, a crack in the empire's spiritual foundation. The Aztecs had been forced to fight a war without a divine purpose, a war that did not feed the gods, but only fed the vultures. The very logic of their warfare was breaking down against an enemy who did not believe in their gods. And in the mountains, watching the Tlaxcalans saw the crack widen. They saw that the invincible ritual was vulnerable to those who refused to play by its rules. The demolition had begun, but the demolition was not complete. For that, you needed the architects of the old system to become the wrecking crew. That moment came in the spring of 1521, on the flooded causeways leading into Tenochtitlan. Cortés had returned with his Spanish corps, but his army was now a Tlaxcalan one, 50,000 warriors who knew every inch of the lake and every stone of the hated city. They did not come for gold or God, they came for a debt, 80 years in the collecting. Watch them on the first assault, a Tlaxcalan captain. His face painted not for ritual capture but for total war, leads the charge across the Tacuba Causeway. He does not carry the traditional xochiyaoyotl club designed to maim. He carries a Spanish pike, its steel tip aimed for the heart. The Aztec defenders, expecting the old dance of feint and grapple, are met with a killing thrust they have no ritual to parry. The hunters from the Flower Wars had become the besiegers, and they showed no mercy. This was the cathartic, terrifying release of finally turning the tables on a long-time bully. Every Tlaxcalan warrior on that causeway had lost a brother, a father, or a son to the altars of the Templo Mayor. They had been the harvest. Now they were the reapers. They fought with a ferocity that unnerved even the Spanish, a pure, focused vengeance that ignored strategy in favor of slaughter. Where Cortés sought to breach and control, the Tlaxcalans sought to erase. They did not take captives. They pushed defenders off the causeways into the lake, where the weight of their cotton armor pulled them under. They set fire to buildings that had once held their bound kinsmen. The Aztecs, under the brilliant, desperate command of Cuauhtémoc, fought back with the courage of the doomed. But they were fighting two enemies, the Spanish steel that broke their ranks, and the Tlaxcalan hatred that broke their spirit. The sacred protocol was not just broken now, it was being used against them. A Tlaxcalan warrior, spotting an Aztec captain, would shout the names of captured towns, a litany of humiliation before cutting him down. The war was no longer xochiyaoyotl, it was yaoyotl, just war, total war. By the final starving weeks of the siege, the Tlaxcalans were the tip of the spear. They filled in the canals Cortés's brigantines could not reach. They led the charge into the city's heart, district by district. When the last Aztec stronghold fell, it was Tlaxcalan hands that pulled Cuauhtémoc from his canoe. They delivered him to Cortés, but the look they gave their former master was not one of submission to a new lord. It was the cold satisfaction of a ledger finally cleared. The empire had been bled to death by the very system it created to sustain itself. The altar had cracked at Otumba, at Tenochtitlan. The people it was built to feed tore it down, stone by bloody stone. The silence was the first thing they noticed. After 75 days of siege, the screams, the cannon blasts, the war cries, the sudden quiet was louder than any of it. The Tlaxcalan warrior stood in the main plaza of Tenochtitlan, his feet crunching on shattered obsidian and dried blood. Before him lay the toppled stone idols of Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc, their carved faces staring blankly at a smoke-hazed sky. The altar at the summit of the Templo Mayor was dark, no copal smoke, no drumbeat, no heart. For the first time in living memory, was being offered to the sun. He did not raise his weapon in triumph. He simply stared. His name was Tlasalel, and he had lost 2 brothers and a son to the stone on that very platform. For 80 years, his people had been brought here as the harvest of the Flower Wars. Now he was standing in the hollow heart of the machine, and it was dead. The gears of ritual had ground to a final, permanent halt. The cold of the granite seeped through the soles of his sandals. This was the victory. Around him, the city died not with a bang, but with the whimpers of the starving and the soft crackle of dying fires. The canals were choked with bodies. The splendid adobe houses were empty shells. The Spaniards were already dragging gold from the palace, their voices sharp and alien in the stillness. But for Tlasalel and the thousands of Tlaxcalans in the square, this moment was not about plunder, it was about presence. They had not just conquered a city, they had stopped a cosmic clock. The war for captives was over. It had ended by destroying the civilization that needed them. He looked at his hands, calloused and scarred from the final brutal push across the causeways. They were the hands that had finally balanced the ledger. Yet, as the adrenaline faded, a profound emptiness settled in its place, the hollow, quiet aftermath of getting exactly what you wanted, and realizing the cost is a world forever changed. The sun, which the Aztecs fed with blood, rose the next morning on a different valley. The altar would remain cold. The silence would remain. And the reapers, their vengeance complete, now stood alone in the field they had scorched bare.